If you stand at the town square of Millersbridge just before sundown, you can hear history breathe. It comes with the rustle of elm leaves and the rattle of the old clock tower, with the scrape of a broom across the bakery stoop and the distant whistle of a freight train curving along the river. But if you listen more closely, really listen, you'll hear a softer sound. Voices, layered like rings in a tree, telling stories that most people have forgotten. When I first arrived in Millersbridge, I thought I was coming for quiet. My job at the county library had ended with a budget cut. My city apartment felt smaller by the day, and I wanted somewhere to hear my own thoughts. The town, with its gingerbread porches and paint-faded storefronts, promised stillness. It delivered something else, an invitation. It began with a flyer thumbtacked to the notice board outside the diner. Millersbridge Oral History Project seeking volunteers. Hot tea, lemon cookies provided. The meeting was at the Senior Center on Walnut Street. The flyer had been printed years ago. The edges were sun-bleached, the staples a little rusted, yet someone had taken the time to straighten it and add a new date in blue pen. Curiosity tugged at me the way a loose thread tugs at a sleeve. I went. Inside, the Senior Center smelled of lemon oil and memories. A sun-faded quilt hung on one wall, each square stitched with a family name: Alvarez, Bennett, Cho, Henderson. Folding chairs creaked as a half-dozen elders settled in faces mapped with laughter lines and hard seasons, eyes alert. A younger woman with a clipboard, Eliza, the town's part-time librarian and full-time organizer, smiled and waved me over. "We gather on Thursdays," she whispered. "They tell stories. We record. The rule is simple: no rushing, no correcting, no judgment." She tapped her pen against the clipboard. "And we listen. Really listen." The first to speak was Mr. Amos Whitby, a retired machinist whose hands had the dignified tremor of age. He wore a flat cap and a tie pin shaped like a tiny wrench. "When I was a boy," he began, "there was a woman on Birch Street who baked bread so good the birds lined up on the fence to sing while it cooled. After the flood of '54, when folks lost more than they could count, she went house to house with loaves wrapped in newspaper. Said it was easier to cry while chewing." He chuckled softly. Never knew if that was true, but the town stopped shaking for a little while. Next was Mrs. Pearl Garrison, who had once run the dress shop. She passed her fingernail over a frayed hem in the folded quilt and said, "This one's mine. I stitched it the winter my husband shipped off to Korea." Folks brought scraps, wedding satin, work shirts. The skirt, a teenager insisted, was ruined by a bicycle chain. I used to think I was sewing fabric. Turns out I was sewing courage. A man in a plaid shirt, Eugene Hall, tapped the microphone timidly. "I wasn't going to talk," he said, "but I guess I will. My mother took in laundry when Daddy got hurt at the mill. I used to deliver the clean shirts back in a wagon. One day, the banker's wife stopped me on the sidewalk. She tucked $1 in my pocket, more money than I'd ever seen, and said, 'A town is held together by the hands you don't see.' I kept the bill under my mattress for years. Didn't spend it, didn't need to. I had the words." As the afternoon thinned toward evening, the stories unfolded like maps, roads I hadn't known, existed suddenly connecting everything I thought was separate. They weren't just anecdotes. They were lessons wrapped in twine, passed down with a wink or a tear. Eliza switched memory cards and refilled teacups. I forgot about the clock. During a break, I wandered to the hallway and studied a bulletin board cluttered with photographs. The river frozen hard enough to skate on. A parade of tractors down Main Street. A wedding party standing proudly in front of the old church, with its white clapboard siding. One photo stopped me cold. It showed a group of school children from the 1940s lined up on the steps of Millersbridge Elementary. A girl in the second row, bright eyes, serious mouth, looked exactly like my grandmother Alma at that age. Back in the circle, I waited until a pause settled. "Was there ever a teacher named Miss Harland?" I asked, heart skipping. "Tall woman, hair pinned back, strict but kind." Pearl smiled. That was Eleanor Harland. Taught 4th grade forever. She could make a chalkboard behave. Pearl's eyes warmed. Why? My grandmother grew up near here, I said. She used to talk about a Miss Harland who kept a jar of blue marbles on her desk. If you learned a new word, you earned one. She said those marbles paid her way to the city in her mind, long before she had the money to go. Amos slapped his knee. Blue marbles. I'll be. Eleanor called them pocket skies, said every child needed a piece of horizon they could carry. Laughter rustled around the room like leaves. Something inside me loosened. I had always known my grandmother's stories were anchors, but I hadn't expected to find their mooring in this town. I felt suddenly less like a visitor and more like someone returning to a house that still smelled faintly of her perfume. Eliza leaned forward. Would you be willing to help us collect more? We've been trying to organize the recordings into themes: work, worth, love, leaving, storms, rebuilding, firsts, lasts. But honestly, we just need more ears. Some days they outnumber us. She glanced at the elders, who were whispering and teasing each other like schoolmates. I said yes before she finished asking. The following Thursday, I arrived early with a borrowed recorder and a notebook already freckled with questions. The sky hung low and silver, the kind of day that makes tea taste better. As people trickled in, I found a seat beside Mrs. Dinah Cho, a retired nurse who kept peppermints in her pocket and opinions in ready supply. Ask whatever you like, she said, unwrapping a mint with a crisp twist. Just don't ask a question you're not prepared to hear the true answer to. I pressed the red button. What's something you wish the younger folks knew? Dinah didn't hesitate. That time is not a straight road. It's a spiral staircase. You think you're moving away from where your grandparents walked, but give it a few years, you'll pass the same landing they did, only with different shoes. Learn from their missteps. Copy their brave. She popped the mint into her mouth. And call your mother. The room laughed. Then she told me about night shifts at the clinic when the winter of '78 brought a run of pneumonia, about quilting bees that turned into soup brigades, about how the town's strength lived in casseroles left on porches with no note because everyone already knew who needed them. Across the circle, Mr. Hall cleared his throat. Tell her the whistle story, he urged Harold Bennett, who sat half-hidden behind a potted fern, chewing the end of a toothpick. Harold grinned sheepishly and leaned toward the mic. All right then. When I was 16, I wanted to quit school and work the riverboats. Good money, fast friends, bad odds. My father didn't shout. He took me to the railroad crossing, handed me the pocket watch his own father carried, and said, Listen. We stood there until the 4-5 roared by. As it faded, he said, Every whistle is a direction. You can let it pull you, or you can decide for yourself where to go. But if a whistle decides for you, you'll never know which way was yours. I went back to class on Monday. Eliza scribbled notes, eyes shining. I looked around the room at hands that had built porches and mended uniforms, at faces that had learned to smile even when the pantry was thin, and I realized the obvious thing that somehow had never felt obvious. The world is made of stories, and stories are made of people, and people don't last forever. But if you listen, their voices do. As the afternoon waned, we formed a loose queue near the old phonograph in the corner, its brass horn curved like a trumpet lily. The center kept it as a relic from dances long gone. Amos cranked it until a scratchy waltz filled the room. Pearl stood and curtsied to no one in particular, then laughed at herself and sat back down, a little breathless, entirely pleased. Before we left, Eliza pulled a cardboard box from a closet. Inside were cassette tapes labeled in fading marker, Storm of '62 Mrs. Alvarez, Mill Carpenter's Monsieur Reddick, Blue Marble Lesson E. Harland. My hands shook as I read the last one. May I? Take it, Eliza said softly. Digitize it if you can. Bring it back next week and tell us what you hear. That night in my rented room above the baker's shop, I dug an old cassette player out of a thrift store bag and fed the tape into its hungry mouth. A hiss, a click, a clearing of someone's throat, and then a voice clear as sunrise, warm as bread. "Good morning, class," said Miss Eleanor Harland. "Reach into the jar. If you pull a blue marble, the word you learned today is yours to keep." I pressed pause and closed my eyes. The past wasn't gone. It was waiting in jars and quilts, in pocket watches and whistles, in the steady breath of a town that still believed a story could change a life. I thought of the teenagers scrolling their phones outside the diner, of the way they rolled their eyes at anything older than last year's sneakers. And I knew what my work in Millersbridge would be. We would collect the voices. We would bind them into something you could hold. And the young people, restless, bright, hungry for meaning, would hear the old truths in new ears. The only question was whether we would find the courage to listen long enough. The following Thursday, I returned to the senior center with a digitized recording on a flash drive. Eliza beamed when I played a clip of Miss Harlan's voice through the modern speakers. The elders leaned forward as if greeting an old friend. Amos wiped his eyes. "I'd forgotten how she sounded," he whispered, like a ruler tapping the desk and honey poured over biscuits all at once. That moment sealed my place in the circle. I wasn't just listening anymore. I was carrying their voices forward. And with that came responsibility. Eliza had an idea. "Next week," she announced, "we'll invite some high school students. If we don't pass these stories along, they'll fade like chalk in the rain." The following Thursday, 5 teenagers shuffled into the center, hoodies, earbuds, and skeptical expressions. They slouched in folding chairs, fiddling with phones. The elders watched them with a mixture of amusement and challenge, like seasoned athletes eyeing rookies. Mrs. Dinah Cho broke the ice. She rattled her candy tin and held it out. "Peppermint?" One boy shrugged and took one. "Thanks, I guess." Dinah smiled. First rule of Millersbridge: never say no to free candy or free advice. Both come wrapped. You don't know what you'll get until you open them. The teens chuckled despite themselves. Amos leaned toward the microphone. "When I was 15, I wanted a bicycle. Cost $20, might as well have been $200. My father said, 'Earn it.' So I took a job sweeping at the machine shop. First week, I hated every minute. Grease in my hair, blisters on my hands. But one evening, Mr. Pike, the shop owner, clapped my shoulder and said, 'A man's worth isn't in what he owns, but in what he keeps working at even when it stings.' By August, I had the $20. I bought the bicycle, sure. But more than that, I bought the knowledge that sweat pays interest. Every job since then, I've thought about Mr. Pike's words." The teenagers leaned in. One girl whispered, "My dad says that too, about sticking with things." Amos winked. "Then your dad's a smart man." Next came Pearl. She unfolded a yellowed letter, edges soft with time. "My husband wrote this from Korea, in 1952, she said. He described the snow like ash, the waiting like fire. At the bottom he wrote, 'If I don't come back, sow courage into every dress you make.' Well, he did come back, but those words stitched themselves into my bones. When customers asked for hems or buttons, I sewed a little courage in too. Not always visible, but there. I want you young folks to know, love isn't in the flowers or the candy. It's in the courage you leave behind when you walk out the door." One teen girl blinked hard, as if swallowing tears. Pearl noticed and patted her hand. Eugene Hall shifted in his seat. The flood of '54 nearly drowned this town. Water took houses, shops, even the church organ. Folks cried, sure. But the next morning, we lined up with buckets, shovels, hammers. One woman, Mrs. Latham, set up a kettle on Main Street, handed out stew to anyone who passed. I learned that day a town isn't buildings, it's hands holding other hands. The teens listened, frowns of concentration replacing smirks. One boy asked, "Weren't you scared?" "Terrified," Eugene admitted. But fear's a poor excuse to quit. You rebuild anyway. By the end of the session, the teens were leaning forward, phones forgotten. They asked questions. What happened to the bread lady? How did you fix the organ? Did the quilt survive the flood? And the elders answered with relish. Dinah Cho leaned over and whispered to me, "See, they came for candy. They stayed for marrow." Afterward, I walked the students down Main Street. Amos pointed out the machine shop, now a hardware store. Pearl gestured toward the empty storefront where her dress shop once stood. Eugene showed the high water mark scratched into the bricks of the post office. The teenagers snapped pictures, suddenly eager to document. One boy muttered, "We've lived here our whole lives and didn't know any of this." "That," Eliza said, "is why we listen." The following week, 2 of the teens returned on their own. They brought friends. By the month's end, Thursday circles were crowded, elders on one side, students on the other, stories flowing between them like water across stones. I noticed something remarkable. The elders seemed lighter, as if telling their stories kept them alive longer, and the students seemed steadier, as if hearing them gave them roots. One evening, as we packed up, Eliza said quietly, "The past doesn't just live in tapes or photos. It lives in people until they speak." But here's the question. Will the young carry the voices forward, or will they set them down when life gets busy? Her words lingered. Because we were about to learn the answer. The senior center was fuller than I had ever seen it. Rows of chairs spilled into the hallway, and the air buzzed with the clatter of walkers, the zip of backpacks, the scrape of folding metal legs against linoleum. Teenagers and elders sat shoulder to shoulder, passing peppermint candies, swapping jokes, and adjusting microphones. What had started as a handful of reluctant listeners had grown into something alive, something the town hadn't known it needed. But beneath the hum of voices, there was urgency. Dinah Cho's seat remained empty. The peppermint tin sat unopened on the table, a note resting on top. "Hospital tests. Back next week, Lord willing." When the students asked, Eliza explained gently. "She's unwell, but she wanted us to keep going. She said, 'Stories don't stop just because I do.'" The room fell quiet, each person holding that truth. Amos cleared his throat. "Then I suppose I'd better talk before I can't either." He chuckled, but his eyes glistened.
"You all know me as the machinist, but once, just once, I was a coward."
The students stiffened. Amos had become their steady compass, the one who always spoke of grit and sweat. "It was 1961, he continued. "The mill workers were fighting for safer conditions. I signed the petition, sure, but when the manager called me in, I tore my name off. I was afraid of losing my job." That night, my father said, "Son, every hand blistered from work is already a signature. You don't get to erase that." It took me years to understand. Work isn't just about wages, it's about what you'll stand for when standing costs you something. A hush settled. One boy whispered, "Did you ever put your name back?" Amos nodded slowly. "Eventually. It was too late for the first fight, but not for the second. And I never took it off again." Pearl lifted the quilt from the wall, spreading it across her lap. The students leaned in, tracing the seams, the careful stitching. "Every scrap has a story," she said. "This blue satin? A girl's prom dress. She danced one night before her sweetheart shipped overseas. This flannel? From a farmer's shirt he traded it for a pair of gloves when winter bit too hard. And this one," she touched a square of faded calico, "belonged to my neighbor, Mrs. Watkins. She used to say, 'Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's sewing one more square even when your thread keeps snapping.'" A girl in a hoodie brushed a tear away quickly. Can I sew one too? For Dinah?" Pearl's face broke into a smile. "Yes, child. Bring me a scrap. Anything you choose." That night, the girl returned with a piece of her brother's old soccer jersey. Together, they stitched it in new thread woven into old. The following week, Dinah returned, thinner but fierce. She carried her peppermint tin like a crown. "Don't look at me like I'm glass," she scolded. "I came to talk, not to be wrapped in cotton." The students laughed, relief flooding the room. Dinah tapped the mic. "Here's my story. When I was a nurse in the winter of '78, the flu swept through town. We ran out of medicine. I thought we'd lose half the children, but old Mrs. Alvarez boiled onions, garlic, vinegar, swore it chased the fever. We laughed, but we used it. Some got better. Maybe it was the brew, maybe it was hope. Doesn't matter. The lesson is this: when official answers run out, community becomes the cure." The students scribbled furiously. One boy raised his hand. "So, hope actually heals?" Dinah leaned forward. "It does, and don't let anyone tell you different." It was Harold Bennett, usually quiet, who delivered the story that turned the room inside out. He placed an old photograph on the table, a line of black and white workers, side by side, hammering boards after the flood of '54. "This picture almost never existed," Harold said. "Back then, some folks didn't think neighbors of different colors should work together. But when the water rose, no one asked about skin. They asked about strength. We hammered side by side." Someone snapped this photo. The newspaper refused to print it. Gasps rippled among the students. One girl whispered, "That's not fair." "No," Harold agreed. "But truth has a way of waiting. Now you see it. Now you carry it." For a long moment, no one spoke. The photo lay between us like a mirror. The teenagers stared, faces taut with realization. It wasn't just about old stories anymore. It was about choices they would face, battles they would inherit. Finally, Amos said softly, "You asked why we talk. This is why. Because silence is heavier than bricks. And if you don't speak, the truth drowns." After the session, the students gathered in the parking lot, buzzing. One boy held up his phone. "We should post these. Like, record them properly, put them online." Another shook her head. "No, better let's make a podcast. Call it Voices from the Past. People everywhere should hear." They argued, laughed, planned. The elders drifted out slowly, smiling as they overheard. Pearl leaned on her cane, whispering to me, "I never thought I'd see the day our stories traveled farther than Main Street." I watched the students, voices rising like sparks into the night, and knew the past had done its work. It had leapt the gap, bridged the years. The question now was whether the young would carry the flame or let it flicker. The first episode was already in their minds. Microphones borrowed, stories cued, titles scribbled on notebooks. But would they keep the promise? Would they honor the voices long enough to let the world hear? The answer waited in the final chapter. The first 3 episodes of Voices from the Past were raw, scratchy, filled with coughs, laughter, and the scrape of chairs on linoleum. Yet they carried a warmth that polished productions could never match. Word spread quickly, first through Millersbridge, then into neighboring towns. By the end of the month, the podcast had 200 downloads. Not a number to impress the world, but in Millersbridge, it was as if the elders' voices had been carved into stone. A reporter from the county newspaper came to a Thursday session. She scribbled notes, snapped photos of Pearl's quilt, and later published a headline, "Old Voices, New Ears. Students Revive Town's Memory." The effect was immediate. Former residents scattered across the country emailed in. One wrote, "I left Millersbridge in '72. Hearing Amos talk about the machine shop took me home in a way I never thought possible." Another wrote, "I was one of Miss Harlan's students. I still have my blue marble. Thank you for reminding me." The elders beamed. "Imagine that," Amos whispered. "Our words flying farther than the trains ever carried us." Until now, the microphones had mostly faced the elders. But during one session, a student named Kayla cleared her throat. "Can I share something?" she asked. The elders nodded. Surprised, Kayla leaned toward the mic. I used to think Millersbridge was dead. Just old bricks and slow streets. I wanted to leave as soon as I could, but now I hear what lived here before me, and I feel part of it. The room hushed. Amos wiped his eyes. Pearl clutched the quilt tighter. Another student, Marcus, chimed in. My dad works double shifts. I thought it was just about bills. But when Mr. Whitby said blisters are signatures, I saw my dad's hands differently. He's been writing his story all along. I just never read it. The elders listened, heads nodding in approval, as if the torch had already passed. By spring, the podcast had listeners in other states. A professor from a university emailed, inviting the group to speak to her oral history class. A church in the city asked if they could play the episodes during Sunday school. Even a regional radio station replayed excerpts. The students marveled. We thought this was just homework, one admitted. Now people out there, people we'll never meet, are learning from our neighbors. Eliza smiled. That's the secret of stories. They travel farther than we do. One Thursday, Amos shuffled in slower than usual. His breath was shallow, his voice weaker, but his determination burned brighter than ever. I don't have much time left for microphones, he admitted. So I'll leave you this. Don't mistake noise for voice. The world is full of noise, tweets, posts, shouts. A voice is different. A voice is what stays when the noise fades. He leaned forward, eyes fierce despite the tremor in his hands. Promise me you'll keep your voices true. The students promised, some with clear voices, others with tears choking the words. That night, they sewed a new square into Pearl's quilt, deep gray fabric, embroidered with the word voice in golden thread. The podcast was no longer just a school project. It had become a lifeline, a thread tying past to future. Yet time moved on, relentless. Seats in the circle grew emptier, voices softer. One Thursday, Pearl arrived with the quilt folded across her lap. Her face was pale, but her smile steady. This is yours now, she told the students. Carry it forward. The students gasped. But you... Pearl shook her head. Quilts aren't owned. They're continued. The final square trembled in her hands, waiting for the next stitch. The quilt lay across the table like a map of time, scraps of lives stitched into one fabric, new and old threads intertwined. Pearl smoothed the cloth with trembling hands. Her eyes searched the circle, resting on each student. This is yours now, she repeated, her voice soft but firm. I began it with fabric, but you've begun it with voices. Keep stitching, keep listening, promise me. The students leaned in, their voices overlapping. We promise. Pearl grew too weak to attend after that night. But the quilt stayed at the senior center, waiting for new squares. The students took turns guarding it, carrying it to classrooms, even displaying it at a county fair booth labeled Millersbridge, where voices live. Visitors traced the seams with reverence. Some donated scraps of fabric with notes pinned, From my wedding veil, 1,968. From my son's work uniform. The quilt expanded, becoming not only Pearl's legacy but the town's collective memory. The podcast crossed borders. A history museum in another state featured it on their website. Teachers played it in civics classes. A grandmother in Canada wrote, Your stories sound like mine. Thank you for reminding me my voice still matters. For the students, the realization was staggering. Their small project in a sleepy town was shaping how strangers understood family, courage, and time. Amos's words echoed, Noise fades. Voice remains. One evening, the students turned the microphones fully on themselves. Kayla spoke first. I used to think our generation didn't have stories worth telling, but I realize now we're already writing them. Someday, someone will want to know what it felt like to grow up scrolling phones, or what courage looked like in our classrooms. We're squares in the quilt too, Marcus added. My dad's hands told his story. even when he didn't. Now I'll tell mine. And maybe one day my son will tell his. That's the only way the thread keeps running. Their voices shook, but they were steady enough to be carried. Miller's Bridge changed. Murals colored the brick walls. A festival was launched called Echo Days. And the school introduced a new subject, oral history. Thursday circles became town events, with parents and children attending together. Even businesses joined in. The bakery printed quotes from the elders on their paper bags. The diner placed QR codes linking to episodes on menus. Stories no longer lived in corners, they lived everywhere. The last time Amos came, his hands were too weak to hold the microphone. A student gently steadied it for him. His voice was almost a whisper. Don't wait until you're old to speak truth. Speak it now. Every year you stay silent, the quilt loses a square. Those were his last words on record. A week later, the chair he used sat empty, but the echo of his voice filled every corner. As I looked around the circle, empty chairs alongside full ones, old hands replaced by young, I understood the true meaning of inheritance. It wasn't money or property. It was stories, voices carried across time. The quilt was no longer just fabric. The podcast was no longer just audio. They had become bridges across generations, proof that memory doesn't vanish if someone chooses to hold it. And now, dear listener, the question comes to you. In your family, in your town, in your own heart, what voices are waiting to be heard? Which stories are stitched quietly into quilts you've never unfolded? Don't wait. Ask. Listen. Record. Because one day, the voices you love will fall silent. And the only way to keep them alive is to carry them forward. Share in the comments. What story from your past or your family's past still guides you today? Subscribe to Years Ago Stories for more forgotten voices, more hidden lessons, more echoes that refuse to fade. Because someday, your voice will be the one someone else is waiting for.